Hey, Western Civ 2. This is the promised video that I would have up on YouTube for today's lecture. For those of you who couldn't make the actual Zoom meeting due to storm power outages and then whatever other reasons. And also for you all to have just to take notes or whatever you need for that. So we're going to talk about positivism, Darwinism, and we'll probably stop with Darwin. But part two, we'll talk about some other things, some other isms, so to speak. So this is after the Enlightenment and Romantic time period. This is the 1800s all the way up until kind of where we're at now, right? The beginning of the 1900s. We're starting to get creeping closer and closer to World War I. And so we're going to look at some of the actual ideology that's coming out then. So the first one I want to talk about is Comte and his ideology of positivism. The dictionary definition of positivism is a philosophical system that holds that every rational, justifiable assertion can be scientifically verified or is capable of logical or mathematical proof. Comte is the one who essentially created this system of positivism. I've heard it under other names as well. Something similar to it is evidentialism. So he's a late child of the Enlightenment. He was also a one-time follower of Saint Simon. So if you remember back to our socialism, we looked at utopian socialism, and Saint Simonism was an example of utopian socialism. So Comte's got that kind of influence going for him there. He wrote and developed his work through this book called The Positive Philosophy. And it argues that human intellect developed over time along the lines of three stages. So before we go to this next slide and look at the three stages, I want to address a little bit of the definition, the dictionary definition, some problems with the idea of positivism. Some problems with the idea of positivism is that, well, first of all, science cannot verify things, some certain things that we believe to be reasonably true, and we would look at you like you're crazy if you didn't believe them. So I could give an example of this. Science cannot verify science. So the scientific method cannot be verified by the scientific method. Yet, you rarely run into a person who would argue with you that the scientific method is unhelpful and not reasonable. And this dictionary definition literally hinges on, if you hear my kids, it's because they're making loud noises, it's lunchtime. It hinges on this idea of scientific verification. And then obviously logical and mathematical proof as well. Now this obviously should pose a threat to the idea of gods and goddesses, the belief of particularly Christianity, because what this would be used to say is, well, you cannot scientifically verify God, you cannot logically or mathematically prove God, therefore God is not a rational belief. It's an irrational belief. And because it's irrational, you should not believe it. So that's obviously problematic. So this next thing is the three stages. He gave a historical narrative, much like Karl Marx gives a historical narrative of the upper class oppressing the lower classes, right? A class struggle all throughout history, and the only way to fix it is a rebellion. Well, this guy's going to give kind of a historical narrative explaining how human intellect has developed over time. So back in the day, back in the way back day, you have the theological stage. Physical nature is explained in terms of the actions of spirits or gods or goddesses. So if you didn't understand something you were seeing in nature, you just said, oh, that's Zeus having a fist fight. That's why there's a lightning storm. Or, oh, that's Poseidon getting mad. That's why you have the sea storm, or whatever it is. And so early on back in the day, people just blamed things they were ignorant of on the gods. And thus you have the creation of religion. Number two, as they've gotten a little bit past that, they knew it wasn't the gods, so to speak, but there was some kind of metaphysical explanation. We don't understand it quite. There is some abstract reason for this. Even though it wasn't a god, it's still some abstract principle. I'm going to call this the agnostic stage, we're not really sure, but we're pretty sure it's not God's, but we still haven't really put our finger on it, so to speak. Well, as mankind developed, they finally arrived to what's Comte would call the positive stage. Explanations of nature became matters of exact description of the phenomena itself. So, how does a hurricane develop? Well, there's a scientific explanation for it. How does a lightning storm happen? There's a scientific explanation for it. And then, obviously, this positive stage was argued that it shouldn't just belong to science alone, but it should spread to all the other disciplines in the humanities, such as like social behavior. We should apply it to social behavior, sociology, psychology, anthropology, all these different ologies, right? Theology. Positivism was actually called the religion of science because it, in many people's minds, replaced and explained why religions should be replaced by this science, this understanding. Some weaknesses of this, as pointed out when we had our live lecture, but also just in general as weaknesses. These three stages can still be seen today in different cultures. We can even see these three stages even in just like people in America. There's still people that think, even though they can explain nature with science, they also think that above that, there is God orchestrating and being sovereign over all. So the theological and the positive stage can come together and still exist side by side in many people's minds. But the other weakness of this is it seems to basically say ancient civilizations such as Greece and Rome or ancient Egypt added nothing to society. They were just little babies. They were children, right? The theological stage. And then they became adults eventually at the positive stage. But they added nothing during the child stage, to which I would say, really? Ancient Greece? There's a famous quote about Plato: all of philosophy, including today, is a mere footnote to Plato. That he's thought of everything that we've discussed today, for the most part. Now, I know that that's not 100% true, but the point is like they weren't just some dumb mountain people who were just looking at the sky and calling it God. They had explanations for these things, and a lot of what we, for instance, like math, a lot of the things that we rely upon, mathematical principles, which is one part of the definition of positivism that can be proven mathematically, we get from these guys who also had gods and goddesses. It seems like a pretty naive historical narrative to have. I would encourage you just to take a brief minute to copy this link into your browser or type it in manually and watch this video. Just watch the first 2 minutes. I want you to watch William Lane Craig, a Christian philosopher. He's going to respond to a question. Can science know everything? And then it's going to flash forward to a debate that he's having with this guy. It's way older. He's a lot younger, and this other guy is sitting in the chair. And he's going to basically say, do you not agree that science is omniscient, all-knowing? And then William Lane Craig's going to list off 5 things that science cannot prove by science. And so I want you to watch that. It's about 1 to 2 minutes long. You don't have to watch the whole 5-minute video. Just watch 2 minutes till he finishes with the 5th thing where he says the scientific method can't prove the scientific method. Watch that, and you can kind of see some of the weaknesses of the positive stage. I mean, there's so many things that we rely on day in and day out that cannot be proven one way or the other by science. So take a look at that. The next guy that I want to talk about, and the last guy, is Charles Darwin. We're not gonna go into a whole lot, but just a couple of things here. In 1859, he published The Origin of Species, and this is where he's going to assert his idea of natural selection and evolution. Now, he has not yet applied this theory to mankind, and by the way, Darwin did not really come up with evolution as a theory. Many people during his day were discussing it as a theory, but no one had come up with a mechanism that allowed for evolution to be true. So, okay, if evolution is, then how does it operate, essentially? Darwin provides his idea of natural selection, and that's what separates him from the fellow scientists who also had theories of evolution and made him, quote unquote, popular right down into our own day. And so it was a naturalistic explanation, which removed the idea of purpose from organic nature. We'll talk about that a little bit. Eyes were not made for seeing, according to the rational wisdom and purpose of God, but had developed mechanistically over time as a kind of survival mechanic, is the way that you would explain the phenomena of having eyeballs and sight. In 1871, so this is 12 years after his previous work, The Origin of Species, he's going to apply it to mankind. The descent of man. He's going to say that man himself evolved, and this undermines obviously the Genesis teaching of mankind being created, male and female, in the image of God. Because really, there's a lot of Christians today who would claim evolution, macroevolution, is true. They would just say something like God orchestrated it and started it. But the problem with that is you have a hard time explaining the imago Dei, the image of God, from that. So if we evolved from another species, at what point in time did the imago Dei, the image of God, become? You're saying the image of God evolved. Well, that seems to undermine human dignity, that we are separated, that we are above all of creation, right? Because by means of the image of God, not because we ourselves are special, but because God himself stamped himself onto us. So we will actually see, when these things are applied to life, some of the terrible things that could happen. And we'll also see how this is applied philosophically by a guy named Friedrich Nietzsche. That'll be in our next lecture. But for now, I just want to show you just some of the underpinnings. For Darwin's theory to be right, it would essentially take purpose. There's no divine purpose for creation. You have to find purpose in the things themselves. And if evolution is true, then the purpose really is for the strong to survive, right? And it would make sense that you would organize your society on that fact, which is in fact what people start to do. His survival of the fittest is applied to the social relationships, right? Herbert Spence advocates a kind of evolutionary ethics, which say that human society progresses only through competition, and if the weak receive too much protection, the rest of mankind was the loser. Social Darwinism is an oversimplified way often to say might makes right. And you can imagine, we are coming up on the 1900s, World War I, World War II. Hitler is around during this time, right? During World War I. He's soaking up some of these philosophies, and some of these philosophies are literally coming from Germany, as we'll see with Friedrich Nietzsche. So it's no wonder that you get a society that thinks, well, this ethnicity is the strong ethnicity, and all other ethnicities are weak, so we need to eliminate them. Well, you can rationalize that, and you can say that that is the right ethic by basing it on survival of the fittest. Now, not everyone was social Darwinistic. Some people said Darwinism makes sense scientifically, but does not make sense when you apply it to society, and should not be. Do the opposite of survival of the fittest. Now, the question becomes for Thomas Huxley, like, where on earth do you get that? If all of nature itself is telling you survival of the fittest is what's best, it's the purpose, then where do you get the idea that you should do the opposite of it in regards to society? That seems a little bit strange. Another thing that was brought up by, I think, Nick in our live class session, he brought up the idea of why is it that mankind seems to be working against evolution now, right? So the question then would become, why, if evolution is true, macroevolution, why would we be given the reason to then become conscious of the process itself? We're the only species that's conscious of this process of evolution. And the environmental arguments, right, that we're destroying our environment and that the world's being destroyed by mankind essentially progressing in technology and not being responsible, or so to speak, with their thing, those two things contradict. If survival of the fittest is here, and yet the fittest are destroying the environment of all, it seems like we have a contradiction or a self-defeater in terms of that. So there's a couple of really good arguments against believing in macroevolution, but ultimately I want to leave us here. It arrives to the same question and does not answer it. The question of where did things come from? The origin, right? Darwin claims an answer, but what he fails to explain is, okay, let's say we all evolved. Where did the first evolution occur? What bacteria or species, where did it come from which we then evolved? There has to be an origin. How did you come down to three propositions no matter what when you talk about origin? You come down to the idea that matter has always existed, it's eternal, or matter came from nothing. So literally something popped into existence for no reason whatsoever, and nothing was the cause of that. That literally makes no sense. And then the third thing is you might say something along these lines, something supernatural, something beyond what we can see, feel, taste, touch, etc., etc. Something supernatural, a God created and popped this stuff into existence, right? Matter into existence. Now, minus this middle one, right, which was the idea that something comes from nothing. I think we can all reject that. I think even scientists who's convinced of macroevolution would probably be hesitant to say, yeah, that's what I believe. They would probably go along the lines of, well, I actually don't know. And they just wouldn't answer that question, which goes back to my point. Science doesn't answer that question. It does not have an origin question answer to it because it's not a science question. It's a philosophy question. It's a question of reason. It's a question of logic. It's a question of origin, philosophy, the love of wisdom, whatever. But let's say the first one where you say matter is eternal. Well, now you've just given what usually is a divine attribute, and you've just given it to something of nature itself. Now you're just basically worshiping nature, which, by the way, I want to point out, that's what Romans 1:18 through 30 or so says. It literally says people have suppressed the truth, that God has clearly shown himself through the things that he has made, creation. They suppress that down and they worship creation rather than God. Well, that's exactly what you have to come to. You have to start basically saying matter is all there is, therefore that's all I will love and desire, which is another way of saying that's what I worship. Well, I don't believe that something came from nothing. That's preposterous. I have no explanation for that. That's just a stupid answer. I believe God created things, right? Now, I'm not saying that that's like all you need to prove Christianity is true, but those are questions that you need to understand. Science doesn't answer those questions. The meta-narrative provided by the scientific method and the meta-narrative provided by Darwin or positivism as well doesn't answer those questions. The meta-narrative provided for by Christianity seems to be the best theory to wrap all those things in together, to explain what we can see, taste, touch, feel, etc., and provide a reasonable reason for why it exists. All right, I'm going to leave you with that, and next time we'll do part 2. Thank you guys for stopping by. Make sure you drop a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. See ya.